For folks that are going to be watching this eventually, I'm so
Mhm.
glad to have Miss Ruthi Moore here. She retired as the director of the Visiting Nurses Program at Navy Marine Corps Relief Society. This is an organization established in 1904 that provides financial, educational, and health-related support to members of the naval services of the United States, eligible family members and survivors when in need. It is very interesting. I mean, this is it is generally believed that the military is probably better funded than any other part of society, but even within that, there are gaps in the system that actually require an organization like NMCRS to fulfill this mission. And I got to know Ruthie and I got to know each other through work in the past, but this is something that has always fascinated and inspired me. So thank you, Ruthie, for joining today.
Thank you.
Um, and so with that, like, do you want to tell us a little more about the Visiting Nurses Program? I could never do justice to it the way you could.
I don't know that I'll do justice to it, but I'll try to explain it. Uh, First, you have to understand something about military life. When I first started working for the society, I was a visiting nurse in Hawaii for the society, and I found it interesting that while all of the services have a financial assistance program, Navy Marine Corps Relief, Army Emergency Relief, Coast Guard Mutual Aid, all of them, the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society is the only one that has visiting nurses. And the reason that we have visiting nurses goes back to 1922. And at that time, the Army allowed family members to have care in Army hospitals. The Navy did not, and the Air Force didn't exist. They were part of the Army or whoever they were part of. So the society decided to set up a visiting nurse program to help family members so that their service member could focus on his job. And the idea at that time was that when they finished and the Navy got permission to have the family members get care within the Navy hospitals, then our program wouldn't be needed anymore. And so they figured, a couple of years, whatever. So from 1922 until 1940, we had visiting nurses because they still didn't get into the hospitals. The Navy and Marine Corps families did not get into the military hospitals for care. Now, at that point, it was like they were trying anything to give these family members some help. They the Navy would pay places to have family members come in and have care. They tried the visiting nurses. They did all kinds of bizarre things. But a lot of service members, especially in the lower ranks who didn't live near family, the guys would call in and say they were staying home to take care of their wife or take care of their children because their wife was sick, which meant that life in the military didn't go the way the people in charge of the Navy and Marine Corps thought it should. The guys weren't showing up for work. And you'd think they couldn't get away with that. But in those days, things were a little different. But every time something changed, and we thought, okay, this is when the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society visiting nurse program will stop, something came along and had us keep going. For example, when they got them all into the hospitals for care, then we were in World War II. And then all of the military doctors and nurses, a lot of them were going off to be on the hospital ships. So there weren't people in the clinics or in the hospitals to help as much as they used to have. So they brought our nurses around to do some of those things. And it just continued. I wrote a story about the visiting nurse program, a history of it, when I was still with them. And it was called A Nurse to Fill the Gap. And that is exactly what our program is about. We do the things that need to be done that aren't being done by someone else. And that could be because the military can't do it. It could be because there's no civilian agency that will do it. And that's a point I need to make. When I was first with the program, and I would go out and meet with civilian agencies and all this to see what they could do to help our patients. They said, well, the military takes care of their own people. We don't do anything for them because the military takes care of everything. which was so not true. But that's a perception a lot of people had, was that if you're part of the military, everything is taken care of. So we work against that perception a lot of the time and make sure that if we don't do it, we don't do it if somebody else can do it. If we can convince somebody else to do it, if we can convince someone else to take our patients and include them with the other people they're seeing. And so it goes on and on like that.
That's so amazing, and I think it's something that until somebody actually works, follows you in your footsteps or follows you around, it's kind of hard to realize that part. That's tremendous. So how did you mentioned you started in Hawaii. So how did you actually get involved in the program, and what was your journey
Well,
within that program? You're still volunteering with them, I know. So
yes.
how did you
I
get there?
wanted to be a nurse from the time I was 4 years old.
Oh
Never,
wow.
never changed. Bandaged my sisters if they would sit still, the cat, the dog, the toys, whatever. And so when I was in high school and I was part of the Future Nurses Club and working as a volunteer candy striper, and I was thinking about where am I going to go to college? Because I knew I wanted to go to be a nurse. And I was the youngest of three in a family that didn't have a whole lot of money. So I decided I wanted to go to UCLA. I'm from California. And there was a very small article in the newspaper about the fact that the Army was starting a new student nurse program. This was during the Vietnam time. In case anyone's trying to do the math, I'm 76. So we were looking at, I graduated from high school in 64. And and I saw that article. And so I wrote to the people. They had a name and address in the article and said I was interested in being a nurse and I wanted more information about their program. So I became an Army student nurse. They paid for 2 years at UCLA and my last 2 years at Walter Reed. And there really is I really am answering your question in a roundabout way. So when I was at Walter Reed, I met my husband, my a future husband. He was at the Naval Academy. In fact, we actually met on a blind date for the Army Navy game. I was in the Army and he was in the Navy. I think it's the last time the Army won. But anyway, so because Tim was in the Navy, his first duty station was Pearl Harbor, because that was the only place the military could find an Army hospital and a Navy base close together. And I have to say, both services worked well to get us in the same place. And so while I was there, I met the people at the society, but at that time they didn't have a nurse. And I saw I worked in the OB clinic, I worked in the OB/GYN floor, I worked on postpartum, I did a lot of maternal newborn issues. And when I got out of the Army, we were still stationed in Hawaii and I was looking for a job. So somebody said, well, go down and apply at the society. They need a nurse. So I went down there. And as it turned out, the lady who was in charge said, okay, when can you start? So I started the next day and I said, what am I supposed to do? And she said, I don't know, you're a nurse, go do it. So I had fun because I got to make up what I thought was important for the program. And because I had served in the Army and had actually served in home health capacity in the Army at some point, I understood what I thought ought to be done. And that's where I started my career with the society, and it just sort of escalated. We were stationed in Hawaii 5 different times over the years. So we'd go from Hawaii to Connecticut to Hawaii to, my husband was in the submarine force, and back and forth. So every time I went back to Hawaii, they would hire me to be the nurse again. So the last time we were there, Tim finished up his command tour on subs, and then we went to Washington, D.C. for his last tour, and I volunteered at society headquarters. And at that point, they had about 35 nurses around the world, but there was nobody in charge, which just made me a little bit crazy. So one day, the president of the society came in and he said, do you think we ought to have somebody in charge? And I said, definitely. And he said, okay, would you like to be in charge? Well, that's a dumb question to ask me. I'm kind of a pushy broad anyway. So yes, I became the director of nursing and tried to get some structure into the program, because at that point, and this was back in 80, 82, somewhere in the early 80s, and or mid 80s. And And we had all these nurses doing what they thought they should, but there was no consistency. So some nurses would document on a 3x5 card. Some of them would document on a full sheet of paper. Some of them didn't document at all, which if you're anybody in healthcare, that just makes your skin crawl because you don't know, what have you done? How do you prove what you've done? How did the patient react? So it was a lot of years of trying to get consistency in the program so that if a family left from Norfolk and went to San Diego and they had a health concern going when they left, the nurse in San Diego could pick up where the other nurse left off and take it from there and help the family with continuing to help their problems. Of course, that required that the nurse in Norfolk had to mail the chart out to the one in San Diego. And you can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
It was always a dream of mine that someday, somehow, we would have some kind of a program on computers so that these transfers could take place with minimal problem, so that all the nurses could see what was being done as necessary with and for their patients, so that they could see what other options there were. Not everybody has the same resources in every town, but knowing what they can do in San Diego is enough to make some of the nurses think we should have that somewhere around here and start doing some investigation to see how they can make better choices for their patients to have better care.
That's amazing, and you continue to do it today. So I think yeah, it's been like even as a okay, I was just checking to see if I was muted. Yeah, you continue to yeah, that's the sign of the times. The Zoom based world, if you will. So and you continue to volunteer over there. So that's pretty amazing. Now you brought back some memories of because that's the time we got to work together somewhat. And as the so you mentioned that you became the director of nursing back in 1983. I didn't realize because you were still the director of nursing in 2013 when we started working
Yeah.
together. And
You're
one of the
calling me old.
things, I'm sorry.
You're calling me old.
No, that's not what I meant. It's like very few people I think have the opportunity, but also they are able to capitalize on the privilege to actually build a program like this, which is pretty very inspiring. It's one of the reasons I always like talking to you. Besides the brownies that you always bring us.
Well, I've always been very lucky in that respect.
Right. But I was thinking, like, you as the director of nursing 10 years ago, you presided over a very successful program, which in the industry we call digital transformation, right? Actually turning an organization or business into harness digital technologies to transform itself. And I mean, the reality is in the industry, the success rate of such transformation projects is very, very low. Only 1 in 10 projects, by some counts, succeed.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so which is pretty amazing. And of course, I mean, one of the if I may take some of the credit away from you, one of it was that you had a very strong technical leader next to you within the society. And that definitely makes a difference. But even with that, it is not always the case. It requires the business leader to also have certain attributes. And so I was just wondering, what would be your advice to your peers, your business leaders, executives in other organizations? What would be your advice to them uh, in terms of you know essentially leading an organization towards harnessing digital technology properly?
I think, although first of all, I have to tell you, our daughter's a nurse, and she's an informatics nurse down in Texas. So she and I have actually talked about this over the years because she started off working at one hospital and then got involved, and now she's the head of whatever for 5 hospitals. And we both have recognized that it's not enough to say we're going to be technologically savvy about this. You got to figure out a reason why. It's not enough to just do it because it can be done. You've got to see what value it adds to what you're trying to accomplish. In our case, by the time we started the Nightingale Project, we had added a part of our program, which we called the Combat Casualty Assistance. And that was nurses who were specifically working with the veterans who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan and had so many issues and needed so much follow-up care. And those guys and gals traveled all over the country. I mean, you could count on 4 or 5 moves in a year for some of them. They just weren't ready to be stable in one spot. And and the CCA nurses were as much a reason as the traditional nurses to have the technology, because you have these people you couldn't possibly catch up by mailing a chart to another nurse. One story will tell you what I mean. We had a gentleman and his wife and kids, and he had numerous injuries, physical and emotional, from his service in the war, and they were moving from South Carolina out to Washington State. And they were going to stop along the way to see family and friends and catch up with old buddies and all that. And he was very, very stressed about the idea of being traveling for probably the better part of 6 weeks with no follow-up assistance. So what we did was the nurse and I, the nurse who was following him, we talked with him and said, okay, this is what's going to happen. If you're going to end up in Washington State, your nurse is going to be this person. So when you leave here, you will hear from that nurse. She will have gotten the records that your current nurse keeps. We send them out electronically. She will be in touch with you. And then she will help you wherever you are in the country to find whatever resources you need. And he said, sure, sure, sure. Everybody does that, right? And so we said goodbye. He and his wife and kids drove off. She was on the phone with him within an hour. She had the patient record in front of her because it had gone to electronically. And she did, in fact, have contact with him every other day and could make the notes. And they ended up not going to Washington State. They ended up going to California instead. So she could transfer him to a nurse down there. But he was never, never without some kind of support. He knew who to reach. He knew how to reach them. They kept in touch with him. We could never have done that without the technology helping us. But just having the technology for the sake of being current would not have been a good reason. The nurses would not have bothered to use it because they have enough doing without having to look at some computer screen if it's not going to help them. So that's the main thing I would say. If somebody's going to start looking at doing something to revolutionize whatever program they're doing, if you don't have a good reason for adding the technology, you're wasting your time.
Yeah, thank you for actually reminding me about that aspect, because I think if I were to summarize like couple of key takeaways as a I think the one of the key things that I took away from this is staying true to the problem to be solved rather than being inspired by the technological possibilities.
Yes.
Right. So it is focusing on that aspect.
Very much.
And I if I may add, like just a recollection from when we first started working together. At that time, there was this conversation of actually digitizing it, and there were different ways of digitizing.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember you actually being openly skeptical about the solution until somebody could demonstrate to you that the technology would indeed be an improvement.
Yes.
I distinctly
right.
remember that, and
So
holding the engineers accountable for that. Like, I'm not going to buy this idea until you have shown me that this can actually make a difference.
Yeah.
I think that was that's what I'm reminded of from 10 years ago. Um, so I think which it's very interesting that we as a technologist, we often kind of get caught in this. I wrote this down, so I'm going to actually read it. Somebody just mentioned this to me the other day, that in spite of the best of intentions, we basically come up with technocentric solutions based on the latest fad, whether or not there's a problem, and we don't acknowledge the ground realities and the conditions, and we just embrace it because it's futuristic. Like whatever is the buzzword, metaverse. Back in the days, I remember it was touch, right? You have a device and you go, but what exactly will you do with the device was not understood. So there's a lot of that. So what advice do you have for the technologists? Like how would you like the technologists to you know contribute to meaningful digital transformation initiatives that actually improve the world?
This is going to sound like a strange statement coming from a person who's involved in health issues. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Especially that's true in technology to me. I can't vouch for the rest of the world, but from my standpoint, adding bells and whistles may be something that can be done, but that if it doesn't have a valid reason that improves what I'm trying to accomplish, there's no point in doing it. I'm very much a proponent of the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, because nurses are supposed to be able to communicate with everybody at a fourth grade level. And that includes the people with the PhDs and the rocket scientists and everything else. If it's a health concern, that's something that most people don't deal with. So you're very smart. I know that. But if you have a health question, I've got to keep it simple enough that it's going to fit with what you understand. Because if I'm talking up at this level and it's about health, I'm way over anything you may know. I always told the nurses that I encourage them to go to doctor's appointments with their patients, especially if it was a serious issue. Not that all issues aren't serious, but you know what I mean. If there's a cancer diagnosis or a terminal diagnosis of some sort, you always need another person in the room when the doctor's talking, because if the doctor says something and the patient's listening, and as soon as the doctor says something the patient doesn't understand, he's going to stop hearing anything the doctor says while he tries to make sense out of the last thing he heard that he didn't understand. And having the nurse there, number one, can stop the doctor from talking, and number two, repeat to the patient what was heard. And the same is true with technology. If I'm working on something and I'm going along just fat, dumb, and happy, and all of a sudden I get to some fantastic new skill set on it, if I can't understand it, it's not going to do me any good. So keeping it as simple as it can be while it meets the needs of what I want is the most important thing for me to see in a technology issue.
So that's very profound, and thank you for making that connection from the nurses side to, because that applies to the technologists too. I think it is so and a lot of it has been gained working in the short time that I've had a chance to observe you and work with you, but and similar folks. I think it is very, if I hear you right, it is important for us as technologists to actually seek and understand the human needs, develop empathy with the actual people on that the technology is supposed to serve, and make sure that it serves them. Because without that, at best, it is neutral.
Mm-hmm. And at worst, it's ugly.
Right.
At worst, it's a waste of money.
It's waste of money, and increasingly, it is also something that I think it can be detrimental. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff that has happened with social media as an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to. I don't use social media. Thank you very much.
Probably a wise thing. So let me ask you something on the personal side, if you don't mind.
Okay.
In many conversations, you have often mentioned, your one of your granddaughters. I think you were talking about Christmas trees and candles and so
Yes.
forth. So I know you're a very proud grandmother. How many grandchildren do you have?
We have 5. And I had to hesitate there for a second because our daughter married a wonderful man 2 years ago. He has 4 children. So she acquired 4. We acquired 4 at that point. But one of them is 21 now. So I never know if I should count him as an adult or a kid. But I count him as he's a grandkid no matter what. So we have 5.
Awesome. And one of the things that I have you know, ever since I've known about you, you're a positivist. Your actions, through your actions, you demonstrate that good outcomes are possible, and you constantly seem to bring people together to work together to achieve those. And these days, that mindset appears to be on the retreat. If you follow news or social media or whatever, it seems to be every day there is evidence being brought forth that that mindset is obsolete or should be obsolete or something along those lines. But just I think I share your positivism. I think we can't just give up on that aspect. And so I was wondering, what message do you have or would you have for your grandchildren and their friends on this count?
We've actually talked. Sophie is the grandchild that I think you were referring to. Our kids live in Austin and Boston, and we see Sophie up in Boston more than we see the other four down in Texas. But she and I talk a lot about almost anything, and
How old is she? I'm sorry.
she's 12,
Okay.
and she's not in social media either, but her friends are, and so sometimes she'll talk to me about her friends and what they say and how they act and all that, and she's has become very good at not bowing to peer pressure. And I'm hear parents talk about that too, but the thing is to be true to yourself. I mean, what you figure out what your goals are, what your standards are more than anything else. Is it acceptable to be mean to somebody? Is it acceptable for somebody to be mean to you? And usually if you start off that way, they're real fast going to say, no, it's not acceptable for somebody to be mean to me. Well, then can you be mean to them? Well, no, I guess I can't. And not that Sophie's a real sweetie pie. All the kids are wonderful. Um, but it's it's hard for them, I think. As you say, people tend to be more negative now than they used to be. Um, so trying to find activities that she can do that she feels good about, that she can find other people who have a positive outlook, and that's true for all the kids, regardless of where they are. And they're all coming home in July, and I can hardly wait. But yeah, it's hard, I think, when kids get stuck hearing so many negative things. Sophie's folks don't actually let her listen to the news. She hears discussions about it from all of us, but then it's a filter through what we think. But yeah, they feel like having her hear all of that negative doesn't help anything. So I don't really have good advice. I mean, heck, I barely can handle myself, let alone somebody else. But I think it's important for kids today and anybody to figure out what their value system is and how it relates and helps them relate to the people around them. We can't control the other people, but on the other hand, we don't have to spend time with some of those people, or if we do, we can certainly control the environment at that time. And that's all you can hope for, is to do the best you can and hope for the best.
That is, I think, definitely very sage advice, and it's not just for 12-year-olds like Sophie. It's I think that applies to all of us. And thank you for sharing that. And every time I meet with you, you also live those values. I know that, and but thanks for sharing, putting those in words as well. So yeah, I just realized, I mean, like every conversation with you, time flies, and we are, I think, at about 40 minutes. And while I would love to keep talking to you, um, uh, you know, uh, this is probably as far as we'll be able to go today. So thank you so much for the time, Ruthie. It's a pleasure and an inspiration always to talk to you.